Before getting started, I just want to mention that this year is Illuy Nishmas, my father, Yisroel Ya'akov ben Tzvi, who died on the 8th of Tammuz 13 years ago. This is the 13th Yahrzeit, and it should be Illuy Nishama for my father, and he should be Melos Yosher for us, all of Klal Yisrael, especially at these very difficult and confusing times. This week is Parashat Chukas, and the Erev Rav strikes again, right, in a very, very damaging way, because of the fact that they're the main instigators. Almost all the time, they're the main instigators. And in this week's Parashat, Moshe Rabbeinu gets upset and calls them Morim, although the Medrash darshans out different versions of what that word might mean. But on a pshat level, he's basically referring to the people who are antagonizing and instigating, that they are rebellers against Hashem, and the whole episode takes place. There's so many midrashim, so many drashos on exactly what was said, what happened, what went wrong, why was he punished with not going to Eretz Yisrael of all punishments, because it doesn't seem like the punishment fits the crime. And we've spoken about that in the past as well. But it's a very short episode. And in fact, the truth is, if the Torah didn't make a big deal about it, if it didn't say something, if the way it's presented without much information, and the water came out and everyone was happy. Yeah, they complained at the beginning, and then Moshe got upset, and then they hit the rock, and maybe you would have picked up and seen that Hashem never said hit the rock, and didn't Hashem say speak to the rock and hit the rock? Yeah, most people would have overlooked it, and if it had not been punished, we would have been happy with the entire episode and wondered what to learn from it, and that would have been it. But the fact that the Torah says Lo hamantin bi, that you didn't believe in me, didn't trust in me, and to sanctify my name, and because of that, you and Aaron are going to die in the desert and not go to Eretz Yisrael. It's like, whoa, what now? That compels us to go back and look at what actually happened and what was missing from the entire thing. And there's a lot of different ways to look at it. First of all, because we know already back in Parashat Shmos that after Moshe Rabbeinu came back in the beginning and he complained to Hashem and said, why did you send me? Ever since I went down to Mitzrayim, it only got worse, so what's the point? And then Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu at that point in time, he says, well, now you'll see, even though he could have said, yeah, I understand, it's difficult, I didn't say this was going to happen, I only said Parah wouldn't listen, I never explained or said that the slavery would get worse because of you. It doesn't say any of that, he just simply says that, okay, you're watching the Gula take place before your very eyes. I promised to your ancestors, to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and they never got to see it come to fruition. And here you are seeing it, actualized and coming into reality, and you're complaining about it. So Hashem says to him that because of that, you will see what I will do to Paro. And the Medrash darshans out, and Rashi brings down that you'll see what I will do to Paro, but you're not going to be able to see what I will do to the 31 kings of Canaan, because you're not going in. You're not going to be part of that battle. Yeshua ben Nun is going to be the one to lead them in and lead that battle. And so already back there, even before he started his journey towards Eretz Yisrael, already he was denied the possibility of going in. So what's with this week's parsha? Why is this week's parsha the punishment for that episode all the way back at the beginning? So we have this concept called the Lilus, which we spoke about again several times in the past, and that's where Hashem does things historically as a pretext to fulfill other things. For example, the Medrash in Tanchuma says that Yaakov would never have loved Yosef more if not for the fact that Hashem had told Avram Avinu that your children will be strangers in the land not theirs for 400 years, and they'll go out with Rechush Gadol and I'll punish the people who oppress them. Right? That had to be fulfilled. So how was that fulfilled? Well, Hashem made Yaakov Avinu love Yosef more, so he gave him the Kesonas Pasim, and the brothers would get jealous, and they would sell him into slavery, and then eventually they all go down to Mitzrayim because of Yosef, and fulfill the Gezerah that was part of Bris Ben Besarim back in Abraham's time. So the whole episode with Yosef and his brothers, on the surface of it, looks as if that's the cause, that's the gorim for what happens, and the truth is, it's not. It was because they wouldn't have done it otherwise. Hashem set it up specifically so that this whole thing would megalgal, as the lashon of the Gemara, and they would go down to Mitzrayim in the end and fulfill the Gezerah Bris Ben Basarim, and of course for historical reasons, not just because of the promise, but also because of Kabbalistic reasons going back to prior to Ma'aser Bereshis and creation. Big stuff going on the entire time. And likewise, also Moshe Rabbeinu not going seems like punishment, but classic Torah, perushim and seemingly contradictions. I mean, everything works out in the end because it has to, right? But the Rizal brings down on Parshas Balosecha that when Miriam and Aaron spoke lashon hara about Moshe Rabbeinu not going home to Tzipora all the time, and she was kind of like a widow in his, a living widow, so to speak, where her husband's still living. So then Hashem, of course, censored them for having spoken lashon hara. But the Arizal explains that one of the reasons why they felt compelled to do so, what encouraged them to do so, was really Hashem himself, because of Hashgacha Pratis. What was the Hashgacha Pratis? Well, just before that, Moshe Rabbeinu complains to Hashem and says, "I can't carry the burden of this people the entire time. I want to share responsibility." So Hashem says, "Choose 70 Zakedim, and I'll give them prophecy temporarily, so they become Chamim right away, and they can fulfill the role of being the Sanhedrin without all the learning behind them. They'll have it anyhow because Hashem will give them, and it's a gift." Right? And Eldad and Medad, who were, very humble people, didn't consider themselves to be worthy of such prophecy, and therefore excluded themselves, and Hashem was impressed. Okay, so good. Be impressed, give them a sense of a reward. But what does Hashem do? He not only rewards them, but he gives them prophecy. The prophecy that they thought they were unworthy to get, Hashem gave it to them. Okay, that's good too. Give them some prophecy. Help them find car keys that can't be found. Right? There's lots of things you can have a prophecy about, the stock market, things like that. But what prophecy did they have? So the prophecy they had, and they're yelling out through the camp, that Moshe Rabbeinu is not going to lead the Jewish people into Eretz Canaan. And they don't, this is long before the rock, this is Parashat Balosecha, this is back at the beginning, after they leave Har Sinai, at the beginning of the 40 years. And the rock is at the end of the 40 years. So Miriam hears this, and she figures, well, that's a punishment. If that's a punishment, it must mean that Moshe is doing something wrong. And there's nothing we can see that he's doing wrong other than the fact that his wife is feeling, somewhat left out in the cold. So that must be it. So that encouraged her. So it was like a setup. Kodesh Baruch Hu created a scenario, kind of like to bait Miriam, if you will, to make her believe that she's in the right, only to find out that she's in the wrong, etc., etc. But so why can't he go in, right? So Hashem said to Miriam, because you're not worthy of it. The Jewish nation is not worthy of Moshe Rabbeinu, because if Moshe Rabbeinu were to go to Eretz Yisrael, the Medrash says, and this comes out in Parashat V'Eschanan, right, that he would find Har Moriah, he would build the Beis Hamikdash, he would be Mashiach, and the Jewish people were not yet on the level to have Mashiach. They would still be doing Averos, which means they still have to be punished. And if when Shlomo, who was not the Mashiach, built the Beis Hamikdash, that could be destroyed. As much Kedusha as it had, and it had tremendous Kedusha, but still, it was not considered to be the Beis Hamikdash of Mashiach, so therefore it could be destroyed. And that was the korban in place of the Jewish people after the 850 years of being in the land and being exiled to Babylonia, but the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, so that as a result that the nation can go on. But if Moshe built the Beis Hamikdash, that could not be destroyed. And if it can't be destroyed and the Jewish people need to be punished, they would have been destroyed. So the Medrash says, that's why Moshe says to them in Parashat V'Eschanan, because of you I can't go in. Not because of the rock, because I davened 514 times. And Hashem said one more time, and that cancels out the Gezerah. So I could have canceled out the Gezerah of not going in, but the reason I'm not going in is because Hashem showed me that if I were to go in, then basically you would be destroyed later on, and for your sake, because you're not holding on the proper level. So that's what Miriam hears back in Parshas Balosecha, that the reason why Moshe is not going in is because he's compared to the sun, and the Jewish people are on the level of the moon, so therefore he's not going in with them because they don't have that schus. And the truth is, in this week's Parsha, it also comes out like that too. Because even though Moshe Rabbeinu is still living at this time, and he's the last person, the Leshem explains, who was capable of actually bringing the final redemption single-handedly. Once he died, it takes the nation as a whole to do it, and you can see how that's working out for us in the meantime, because here we are thousands of years later, and there's no Mashiach to report, as far as last I heard. I didn't see the news this morning yet, but I think I would have heard something in Shul if he in fact had arrived, possibly. But in any case, thousands of years later, he does come back in every generation, it says, but mostly to Matak in the Erev Rav, because he took the Erev Rav out. And they're his undoing in this week's Parsha. But one of the episodes that kind of like spills the beans a bit about what's going on over here is after this whole thing ends, they go to try to go into Edom. They come to the border of Edom, which is Esau's descendants, and they ask to be able to cross their land on the way to Eretz Canaan. And Edom says no. The Jewish people say, listen, we don't need to do business, we don't need to buy food, we don't need to buy drink, but we will do all of that. We will benefit you if you will allow us to peacefully cross your land. And they come out to go to war against the Jewish people, which is insane. It's absolutely insane. Why is it insane? Because God's right there. The enemy covered are right there. The man's still falling. The bear Miriam is following them around. They know that God's with them. And they saw what happened to everybody else along the way, whoever tried to challenge the Jewish people. And they still had the chutzpah to come out and say no, and even prepared to go to war against the Jewish people. And God says nothing. And Moshe says nothing. They turn around. They after presenting their story and getting a flat no, a hard no, then they're forced to turn around and say, what's the point of that story? And how is it even possible that it occurred? So Moshe Rabbeinu was basically, he knew this was going to happen. He was aware this was going to be the response. He was not surprised. So then why do it in the first place? Because he wanted to show the Jewish people what they lost, how the world had been transformed. Just like, for example, when they came down with the second set of luchos versus the first set of tablets that he broke after the golden calf, it was not the same level of Torah. The level of Torah that Moshe came down with the first time was called Torah Tzilis, Torah Mashiach. It was a whole different level of Torah without 613 mitzvahs spelled out, right? That because basically the Jewish people wouldn't have needed them on that level, like we want a Mashiach, because most of the mitzvahs are spelled out for us because we need to know how to counteract the Yetzer Hara, because the mitzvahs bring out the Yetzer Hara. They're neged the Yetzer Hara, which draws it out. That allows us to confront it and work on it and perfect ourselves. But once Mashiach comes, as the Gemara says, and the Kosh Baruch Hu shechs the Yetzer Hara, so then we will do mitzvahs as a matter of life itself. We won't need to be told anymore what to do, because we will naturally do it without the Yetzer Hara. The only two mitzvahs that really count are Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God, I took you out of Mitzrayim, and there should be no other gods besides me. And every other mitzvah that we do, there's 247 other positive mitzvahs, and there are 364 other negative mitzvahs, but they're all subsets of those two mitzvahs, of that one positive mitzvah and that one negative mitzvah. Every other positive or negative mitzvah we do is to mekayim those two, which is why those are the only two we heard about Sinai. Two others came through Moshe Rabbeinu. Those are the prime, and that was Torah Tzilis. That was Torah Mashiach, which Moshe came down with the first time. When he did the tablets, right? So the second time he came down with what's called Torah's Bria, which is it is the Torah we have today in our hands, and you can see as 300,000 some odd letters and 85,000 some odd verses, and a lot, and all the mitzvahs are written out and told to us. A little bit of machlokas exactly which are the 613 between the Ramban and the Rambam, right? But in general, everybody agrees, and we all agree, that there are Tayag mitzvot, 613 mitzvahs, and it's all there. And we spend day after day the amount of learning that we do just to get those mitzvahs down, that's what it comes down to. The entire Talmud Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, and the Yerushalmi Talmud, right, and all the Meforshim. You have the Rishonim, the Achronim, the Achrei Achronim, and all the different Sforim that have been written over time, for the sake of allowing us to understand how to properly perform the mitzvah. The Shulchan Aruch What's kashrus? How do you check the animal properly? It's not there. What did tefillin look like? How do you put on tefillin? These are all details that we would not have needed. It says when Yaakov Avinu went to multiply his sheep, he put that loose stick in the ground, and somehow he's yotzi. The Zohar says the mitzvah of tefillin shel rosh, because there's two mitzvahs. It's tefillin shel rosh and tefillin shel yad. The head tefillin, the hand tefillin, they're both separate mitzvahs, part of one mitzvah, but separate sections of the mitzvah. And he was somehow fulfilling the mitzvah of tefillin shel rosh by putting the stick in the ground. How do you do that? I don't know. But since every mitzvah is a concept, and every time we're doing something, it's the fulfillment of some idea, a plan, a purpose for creation. So if you understand this idea, then tefillin is just an embodiment. Every aspect of tefillin is just an embodiment of some concept. And there's different ways to makayim concepts. For example, the mitzvah of divorce. That's when things go wrong. Divorce is for for people whose marriages didn't work out. You don't get married to get divorced. It's an unfortunate consequence, but there's a mitzvah if a marriage is not working out to get a divorce. But there's no mitzvah to get married to get divorced. And yet it's a mitzvah. It's one of the Torah mitzvot. And Shara Gilgulim speaks about how a person is able to fulfill it. But in the world to come, there'll be no such thing as divorce, but the concept will exist. Now, in our everyday language, divorce means you go to a beis din and you dissolve the marriage halachically, and then you go separate ways, right? So how could that be an eternal concept? So that's just what it looks like down here. But as you go to higher levels, the concept behind it will be very different, and maybe even look like the opposite of what it was down here, because it has to somehow tie into unification. The main point over here is that Moshe Rabbeinu was showing the Jewish people that now you're living on the level that even though God's with you, and even though you have the Torah and you have the mitzvahs and miracles are still happening for you, you're living in an everyday world. And there's going to be anti-Semites. Even today, it's not the same thing exactly, because we don't have that level of Gilui, but the amount of miracles that just took place for the Jewish people in this war against Iran and against Hamas and Hezbollah, miracles. You can go back to the 6-Day War, but that many, but there are people who see it. Jews, non-Jews, who see it, and they point it out. And there are non-Jews who are telling other non-Jews, don't start up with the Jewish people, because God's on their side even today. And they can see that. But the rest of the world ignores it completely. And the truth and the facts and still come against the Jewish people. Because that's the world we live in right now. Until Mashiach comes. That's the world that's what Moshe was showing them. So in a sense, Moshe is going to the world to come. The real punishment in this week's Parsha is for the Jewish people. Because they had a chance to fix everything and to go to Eretz Yisrael and have Yemos and Mashiach. No more enemies anymore. That's it. Perfection in the world. And they lost that because they lost Moshe Rabbeinu, because they got him upset, and that was all a pretext to fulfill the Gezerah. But at the end of the day, when you add it all up, it's not so much that Moshe made the mistake and was punished as much as the Jewish people blew it and lost the opportunity to have Moshe lead them into the promised land and the promised era of Yemos and Mashiach. But again, the mechanism to make that happen is the Erev Rav. They're the ones who just don't get it. Now, that's also complicated because the Erev Rav didn't travel together with the Jewish people. They were there, but not inside the Anei Kavod, and they were separate to a large degree, but they're starting to themselves. But as we mentioned before last week, and other times, that you don't hear about them really after Moshe dies, after the Torah is closed with the last word of the Torah. That's it. You don't hear Erev Rav mentioned in the Shoftim and the Nevi'im and the writings. It's just like disappeared. But all of a sudden, you open the Zohar in chapter Sefer Bereshis, the first Chof Hey Amud Aleph in the beginning there. He enumerates Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai spoke about 5 levels of Erev Rav, and then the Gra came along 1,700 years later, and he, exact same thing, built upon the Zohar and going into even more detail. And I'll read something right now that discusses the Erev Rav somewhat, because it's important to know, especially because what he's going to say right now. He says that this is the middle of something, so you're just picking up from the middle here. Okay? He says, Lamadnu. We learned, therefore, from what we just said previously, but you don't know what it is because we're not going to go through it right now. But if you would, you'd see it for yourself, right? Lamadni ke'erev rav einam b'nei erev rav yotzi Mitzrayim dafka. Nowadays, the Erev Rav is no longer, I mean, we're talking about thousands of years later, hundreds of generations later. The Erev Rav today, in our time, he's talking in his time, the 18th century, and all through until the end. And in Kol Torah, he speaks about the final battle of the Jewish people is against the Erev Rav. So clearly, to the end of history, the Mashiach comes, and he says that they're not physical descendants anymore. Ella shehem gilgul nishmasehim shnisarve b'Yisrael. But rather, it's the same souls that existed back then, but they reincarnate into Jews. They reincarnate into Jews, okay? So therefore, the idea of becoming Erev Rav can apply to any Jew from that point onward, right? As the Gemara talks about over there in Beitza, it talks about how the rich people in Babel, they don't have mercy and they don't give tzedakah. They have a lot of money, but they don't give tzedakah, and that just might look like a stingy Jew. But these are signs he's going to bring down of the Erev Rav. V'mar Shabbatai bar Merinus Hani me'erev Rav Kasu. They come from the Erev Rav, he says. The Kasiv, it says in Devarim, V'nasa lachem rechamim v'rachmecha. I will give you mercy and have mercy on you. Kol marachim alabrios b'yadu shehu mezar shel Avram Avinu. It says that anybody who has a rachamim, it's clear that person is from the seed of Avram Avinu. It's one of our main traits is to have rachamim. That they're not from the seed. Now, you have to pay attention to the language over here because we just finished saying that a person can be born Jewish and have an Erev Rav soul inside them. So you're still the Zera of Avraham because you're descending from the Jewish people, going back to Avraham's time before the Jewish people, but the soul itself. So Zaro here means more like, the right hashkafa, the right spiritual connection to the Jewish people. V'nei behemshach atikim Zohar sham isa. So the Zohar continues to say, the following thing: Be'elu chamesh minim. There are 5 types of Erev Rav. Shenamar behem behashem baram. Right. So behei baram. Right. Because it says in the pasuk behi baram. They darshan out the word Behi Baram in the beginning of Bereshis as Behei. He created with 5. He created them, and what are these 5 categories? The Amalekim. They're called Amalekim from the name Amalek. The Giborim. These are all biblical names, even for people today, and he'll explain why. Because these are traits. These are identifying traits of the Erev Rav. And you have an Akim, which means giants, and Rephaim. Are also from the Chumash. Ve'aleya, and over them, right on top of this, Shechina Namar Loto Vara L'Sheves B'neihem Bara L'Sheves Yitzrel Asos Yeshub B'hem. So I didn't make the word for evil. Shem says, and it's referring to the Erev Rav. So the Bira Gra, the Gra explains Amalekim. Who were the Amalekim? Mefosh Bazar Parshat Bereshit Sham the Amalekim Reishim de Bnei Yisrael. They are leaders of the Jewish people, Begalusa, during times of Galus, Klei Chamas v'Gozlim b'Ani Yisrael, and they extort, they do all kinds of nasty things, and they steal from the poor. Okay, v'Heim Esitra Dedor Hamabul, those souls come from the generation of Erev Rav, or at least we call the Tatka Doris, the souls that came in at that time in history, the generation of the flood. Nishmasan dilohon nitzarfu b'Mitzrayim v'nifrad hara me'erev Rav kedei kabil lon Moshe alabasham nisarav nishmasam b'Yisrael v'hu b'galus as agolin. So what happened is that in Mitzrayim, the different different difficulties the Jewish people had. For example, babies being thrown into the Nile River, having to build, Pithom and Ramses and all that. It's like, so all these corresponded to the generations of the flood. That's why they're thrown into the water. And building Pithom and Ramses corresponds to the generation of Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel. Discussion unto itself. But the point is that these souls, that all that we went through Mitzrayim was a way to filter out the bad part, and that went to the Erev Rav in Moshe's time, the actual Egyptians that joined the Jewish people as the Erev Rav, and the Jews themselves became purified. But we see this comes back later on to haunt us, that these sparks can come back even in generations today. That's the Amalekim. So the Amalekim are people who they are leaders during the time of Galus, and they extort and they're cruel to the poor. They won't take care of their own people. Nephilim, right, which means the fallen ones, which refers to the angels that had bad-mouthed mankind and were sent down, and in the end they themselves ended up taking women right out of the chuppah, right from the chuppah. They were doing all kinds of illicit things. So therefore, hein da'azlim basar znus. So those are the people, those are the Jews who go after immodesty, and immoral behavior. V'chein basar batzin da'hai alma. And they also, want to make a lot of money in this world. They're into materialism. They're very extremely materialistic. The isha zona misitra de nephilim, right? A person who's immodest, comes from the Nephilim, right? Giburim, which is the second category, but very similar. Hein Anshe Hashem. Who are they? They come from the generation of of Migdal Bavel, right? When they built the Tower of Bavel, it says they were trying to make a name for themselves. Now, Kabbalah explains it doesn't mean they're trying to get newspapers and become famous, things like that. I mean, at Pshat level, obviously that's what it means, but Kabbalistically it means they're trying to capture the name of Hashem, to use it for their own bidding. The Kol Avdim B'Shvila Soslon Shem Mesitu Dedor Falaga, right? So they come the generation of the dispersion, and their whole thing is to become famous. They do things for notoriety. They do things in order to become popular amongst the people. For example, they might dedicate a shul. He brings down, right? They might, read a Sefer Torah, but not for the mitzvah. No mitzvah involved whatsoever. They're doing it purely so people will talk about them and say how great they are. That puts a person in the category of Erev Rav in this time. Okay, that's the Giburim, and then he goes on to say, okay, Rephaim, right? These were also giants in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu as well. This particular category of Erev Rav are those Jews who do not want to do kindness and give tzedakah to people learning Torah. For whatever reason, they might have their logic, their svara, they might have their excuses, but the bottom line is, as these people are sitting learning Torah, which is one of the most important things you can do in this entire universe, whether a person sees it, agrees with it or not, and if they're specifically, if a person is hiding out the base medrash from having to get a job or to avoid the army, and they're not really into learning, the learning, it's just basically a cover-up, right? That's one thing, right? But if the guy is sitting there learning, this is his thing, this is his maksoah, he's devoted, his life is Torah something so that he's somebody who takes it very seriously, and he has no time to work, and Torah doesn't pay that much money, unless you read a top, best-selling book, right? But it's not, you sit and learn, by definition, you're going to suffer financially. And they need financial help, a stipend. It's not a salary, but a stipend. And people on principle say, no, I could, but I'm not going to. I don't want to. It doesn't, I can't do that, right? That person, I can put a person in the category of Erev Rav. I mean, again, Hashem has to decide the bottom line. And his caveat at the beginning of this chapter, which is this book called Achros Gereshis, based upon the Gemara and the Ramchal, he starts this chapter off. He has a little, introduction where he says, "Okay, you have to be careful before you go around accusing anybody of being Erev Rav. You have to be careful because it's not always so obvious as it might seem to be, right? having said that, now let's go into the whole discussion. But again, we're very quick to throw it out, and we could be 100% correct. And one thing is for sure, that it's one thing to be secular. It's something completely different to go to war against Torah and Judaism. And the moment you go to war against it, like if someone says that we're not Jewish, we're Israeli, and if we could separate ourselves from the rest of the country and become only an Israeli state as opposed to a Jewish state, that could easily and more than likely puts a person in the category of Erev Rav. Because you're fighting against Torah and God and Judaism. Israeli to them just means like French or German. It's a nationality. That's the founding fathers, so to speak, of the modern state. That's the way they looked at things. They didn't have any Jewish consciousness. They wouldn't even put God in the Constitution, and anything they did religious-wise was just as a compromise to try to accomplish their purpose in the end. But they had kibbutzim, people grew up without knowing their parents at the time. And that was the mentality. So you have to be very careful, very, very careful who you call. But on the other hand, when someone does try to go to war, if someone says, I don't want to be religious, that's not such an uncommon thing. Doesn't mean a person's Erev Rav. But when someone says, not only do I not want to be religious, but I don't want the thing to exist at all, and I'm going to do whatever I can to get rid of it, that's already a very, very strong likelihood that the person's Erev Rav. And he goes on to explain it and say more. He says the Anakim, which means like giants also, but it could also mean like a necklace as well, right? Who are they? Heim hamazalzalim tamid chachamim. They are the people who disgrace tamid chachamim. Again, you have to be careful, very, very careful. Again, who you call, and second of all, who you are. I once walked into a base medrash, listening to a bunch of bochrim who must have been 16, 17 years of age discussing a halacha. And they didn't refer to Rabbi Eliashiv as Rabbi Eliashiv, who was the Gadol Hador, but they said Eliashiv. They just said his last name. As if it was like talking about some guy in boch in the base medrash. This is the Gadol Hador, that's a zilzul of Tam Chachamim. It's scary. It's scary how easy it is for a person to find themselves in that category, because we think of the Erev Rav, it's like they're probably Gentiles who are anti-Semitic, and because that's what they were back then, or maybe they're like Reform, but Torah abiding Jews. I've met in the course of many years people who they daven 3 times a day, they put on talis and tefillin, and they had a kosher marriage, and their wives do the mikveh, they keep kosher and keep Shabbos and all that, but some of their attitudes towards Torah and Tam Chachamim and Tzedakah and things like that, it's not the way we look at things. And they feel justified based upon this idea and that idea, and sometimes it's just from being influenced by the world around us. But it's scary enough that a person really ought to ask themselves today, this is the way I think, where did I get that from? What's the Torah basis for that? Is that my own personal feeling, or is that based upon some halacha? Maybe if I'm confused about whether it's authentic or not, maybe I should go ask a shaila to a competent Gadol Hador. That's somebody who feels the same way about that thing like that. But there's lots of people with a lot of attitudes and lots of opinions today, thinking that because they keep Torah in general, or very specifically, that they cannot possibly fall in the category of Erev Rav, and that's not true. That's not true. And you have to also keep in mind that just like 4/5 of the Jewish population did not survive Yetzias Mitzrayim, they died in Makas Choshech because of their attitudes and the way they were living, their perspective on things. And then the Gemara comes along and says, V'chein Yemos HaMashiach, that we're going to have a similar scenario, that a lot of people are not going to make the cut when Mashiach comes. Not just like anyone who's Jewish, you're welcome to stay, and all the rest of Gentiles can, not like that. There'd be a lot of winnowing out. There'd be a lot of birur, separation between those who belong and those who don't belong. So we really have to make sure, all of us have to make sure that our attitudes, our perspectives are correct, especially when you see how this is the case. The first thing he says, but over here, is that we're talking about Gilgulim. right? Someone once said to me, that there's no reason to go to Israel, right? I have no desire to go. You can't tell me I have to go. So I said to him, the Rizal brings down in Shar Gilgulim that the souls of Dor Midbar, together with the Erev Rav, together with Moshe Rabbeinu, they reincarnate in every single generation. So it means in our generation too. Now, what was the problem with Dor Adeh? What was the problem with Dor Midbar back at that time? What was the straw that broke the camel's back that made us have to live and die in the desert over the course of 40 years and not go to Israel? So that was the Meraglim. Even the golden calf was not enough. The golden calf, the perpetrators, 3,000, they got killed, and the rest, the tshuva, and we paid off in installments over the course of thousands of years, right? But that did not condemn us to death in the desert. The spies did, rejecting Eretz Yisrael. So I said why do we reincarnate? Why bring back those souls if not to rectify the mistake? If that's the mistake, then how do you know that your attitude, here you are today, a modern Jew and religious, you're living by Torah mitzvahs, and you go to yeshiva, and you maybe go to a place like Lakewood, even something like that, which is a wonderful place to learn, and in Chutzlarts, but how do you know that attitude you have towards Eretz Yisrael is not because of the fact that you got that soul, and this is your chance to rectify it, and you're not. You're continuing on with the same mistake as Rabbi Elazar Aram said. Anyone who rejects Yisrael, especially on principle today, right? They're bimamshik. They're continuing on with the sin of the spies. How do you know that's not you and that you're making a huge mistake with that attitude of yours? You don't see it that way because you don't connect yourself to the spies. You don't connect yourself to Gilgulim. As far as you're concerned, you're an Orthodox Torah-abiding Jew who happens not to like Israel, surrounded by a bunch of others who feel the same way. And yet, that's exactly who they were. In Midbar, they were Torah-abiding Jews surrounded by people with the same attitude who rejected Eretz Yisrael for Torah reasons, supposedly. Wrong reasons in the end. They just missed the... And you see how right they thought they were, not like they were trying to get back at God, because the moment God said, that's it, I've had enough, no one's going in, and all of a sudden they say, let's go. We thought they were, now we see. No, too late. And they even risk their lives. They even go and kill themselves. Even the God says, I'm not going with you. And you're not going to survive. And they go anyhow. So they obviously must have thought that they were on the right side of the line when all took place. So how do you know you're not this Gilgul? Very, very tricky stuff. You have to make sure that, check yourself out. Cheshbon nefesh. You have to figure out what you think and how you got to that conclusion, where it came from in the first place. Okay? So that's the Anakim. Okay? He says, Va'alayit mar, the lobish field tohu, right? Ihi hashchina dehein erev, right? Ela b'shvil gerim mesita de tov. K'moshe sav lo galu Yisrael lebein umas ela kedei shetisvu aleihem gerim. So the galus, right, is for the sake of winnowing out, of separating out, of filtering the Jewish people to maintain and keep in the fold the righteous people who have the proper attitude. And there will be surprises, huge surprises, because there'll be people who would have thought, I'm going to make the cut, and they didn't, and they won't, because something was not quite right. And the way they looked at history and the Jewish people and Torah specifically and Talmid Chachamim. I mean, the Gemara says at the end, one of the main simanim, the Mashiach is imminent. He's going to talk about it later on in the Sefer as well, in this chapter as well. That is that the chutzpah is going to increase. Now, the chutzpah is so increased today, and it says that the youth will have no respect for the elderly. And the elderly will be forced to stand up for the youth because the youth will claim roles and positions that they don't really deserve, but they're considered to be positions that are mechubadik. So therefore, elderly people who probably deserve those positions don't get those positions, and to stand up for the people who don't deserve it but have them anyhow. That's the world. That's the world, and there won't be a vad emes. It says there won't be truth. Will be missing there. Not just that people are light, it's going to be missing from the world. Missing means like you can't even find it. People don't even know it's not there because it's not like they're looking for it. And of course, it says that the truth will be despised, and those who speak it will be despised, of course, which means Talmid Chachamim, real, authentic Talmid Chachamim, will also be despised. These are simanim. The Mashiach, and the Gra says when that happens, that's it. The governments turn to Minos, they turn to Epicurus, to heresy. They have heretical ways of looking at the world and history and how to deal with such, the world in general. I mean, we're living right in the midst of all of that. And mixed in with that, I mean, what's going on in New York is absolutely unbelievable. Anti-Semitism, you have to understand, in Germany, it was the exact same thing. In Germany, you had Jews, probably even religious Jews, who voted for the National Socialist Party in the beginning because it framed itself as a party of the people, versus the Weimar Republic, which would seem to be inept and not able to do anything and didn't care. It was like, and they, the very party that was going to kill them in the end, do them in, they were part of in the beginning. And you right now you have that in North America. Orthodox Jews or modern Orthodox Jews who are voting for people who really, deep inside, probably can't wait to get rid of all Jews in the end. You have to be very careful. That's for sure. And yeah, he goes into, talk about it in more detail about the whole concept of Erev Rav and how Moshe Rabbeinu comes back in every generation specifically to fix them. You don't see anybody stand up and say, "Hi, I'm Moshe Rabbeinu. I came back again now to work on the Erev Rav. You come with me," right? But rather, it comes in one form or another. But we'll just finish off by re-quoting once again what the Gra says. And he says, this is called a Torah, which of course is controversial, but you can see the truth of it, whether you like the Sefer or not, whether you hold it was from the Gra himself or not, the statement itself is already coming to fruition. You can see it. But he says, and I certainly believe this is from the Gra, through his Talmidim. He says that the final battle that the Jewish people have to fight will be against the Erev Rav. That doesn't mean you're not going to be at war with Iran. Doesn't mean you're not going to be at war with other countries as well. But it means that the essential battle is against the Erev Rav. And he says it's the most difficult one of all because all the other battles, you go to Iran, you're fighting against. Hamas, we know who the enemy is, what they're trying to do. The Erev Rav, he says, they're Jewish. And they're leaders. And they can be religious too. And they're tricky because they make it look like they're working on your behalf when in fact they're doing just the opposite. And it may not be so obvious. I mean, some cases you can see, for example, maybe some names out of here, but certain organizations that have sprung up in the States over the last couple of years who claim to be on the side of Israel, help and being advocates of Israel. In the meantime, they're taking us apart and handing us over on a silver platter to the nations of the world, stabbing us in the back over and over again with a smile on their face and saying, "Hi, I'm one of you guys." Stab, 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 stab. It's like, that's clear. But there's others who are much more, clever about it. It's really, really behind the scenes. You can't see what's going on. The lashon of the Gra is they use a chizus hanayim. They fool the eye. It's trickery. It's like a fooling of the eye. It makes it look like a magician. It looks like you're doing this, but you're really doing this instead. He says that's the worst battle of all because you don't know it's the enemy from within. You can't tell who it is, and you can by the time you realize what you're fighting against, it can be too late. He says everybody has to be in that battle, fighting against the Erev Rav in whatever capacity they can. There's no such thing as neutrality. There's no neutral ground. There's no no, you fight that. I don't want to be involved. I'm not Erev Rav. I don't believe in them, but I don't want to be involved. He says no such thing. If you're not fighting against them, it means you're one of them. And better, you weren't born at all. That's what he says. It's just scratching the surface. Excuse me. We haven't gone into all the details. That's just a little bit of a framework. But the main point that comes out at this time is that you have to be careful. Because the stranger within us is not just the guy next door or the guy a block from you, but also inside of us. We all have this potential. And therefore, to make sure that whatever you think, whatever you believe, whatever direction you're going, whatever you feel strongly about, make sure it's the right thing. Find out if you're going the right direction before you buy into it and it becomes part of you and you lose out on the opportunity to be part of the final redemption. Seres Tevis, Shabbat Shalom, and only good news.